Most people think the worst day of their lives starts with a mistake. Danielle Carter learned that sometimes it starts with someone else's. The thought stayed with her long after that night. But at 6:43 on a quiet Thursday evening, she had no reason to believe anything unusual was waiting for her. Danielle eased her silver sedan through the familiar streets of Maple Grove Estates, a peaceful neighborhood just outside Richmond, Virginia. The late spring sun was sinking behind rows of oak trees, casting long golden shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. After a 10-hour shift managing community outreach programs for a nonprofit organization, all she wanted was a hot shower, a microwave dinner, and a few episodes of her favorite crime drama before bed. Her phone sat in the cup holder beside her, playing soft jazz through the speakers. Everything felt normal, predictable, safe. She turned onto her street and immediately noticed something strange. Cars were parked along both sides of the road, more than usual for a weekday evening. Several neighbors stood outside their homes instead of being indoors preparing dinner. A young boy riding a bicycle stopped and stared toward the end of the block. Danielle slowed down. The closer she got to her house, the quieter the street seemed to become. Then she saw the flashing lights. Red and blue reflections bounced across windows, driveways, and garage doors. At first she assumed there had been an accident nearby. Maybe someone needed medical assistance. Maybe a utility crew was helping emergency responders. But as she continued forward, her stomach tightened. The lights were clustered directly in front of her house. One police cruiser became two. Two became four. Then six. Then more. Danielle blinked several times, convinced she had counted wrong. She pulled her car to the curb across the street and looked again. 10 police vehicles occupied nearly the entire block surrounding her property. Officers stood near their cars speaking into radios. Several neighbors watched from their lawns. Others recorded with their phones. Danielle remained seated behind the wheel. Her hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, but confusion spread through her mind. She searched for a logical explanation. Had a neighbor reported suspicious activity? Was there a missing person investigation? Had someone used the wrong address on an official report? None of it made sense. She had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 8 years. She paid her bills on time. She volunteered at local events. She knew most of the people on the street by name. Yet every flashing light seemed pointed toward her home. A police officer glanced in her direction. Then another. Within seconds, several heads turned toward her vehicle. Danielle took a slow breath. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And although she did not know it yet, the next hour would change the lives of everyone standing on that street. Danielle kept both hands visible on the steering wheel as she watched several officers begin moving toward her car. The flashing lights painted shifting patterns across her windshield, turning an ordinary suburban street into something that felt strangely unreal. A few minutes earlier, she had been thinking about dinner. Now dozens of eyes seemed fixed on her every move. She lowered the volume of the jazz music and rolled down her window halfway. The evening air felt cooler than before. One officer stopped a few feet from her driver's side door, while another remained near the front of the vehicle. Neither appeared hostile, but both carried the unmistakable posture of people expecting a problem. "Ma'am, please remain in your vehicle," the first officer said. Danielle nodded immediately. "Of course. Can someone tell me what is happening?" The officer exchanged a quick glance with a colleague before answering. "We are working through a situation right now. Please stay where you are." It was not an answer. It was a delay. Danielle could feel it. Around the neighborhood, more people had gathered. Some stood on driveways. Others watched from porches. Several phones remained pointed in her direction. She recognized many faces. Mr. Hansen from 2 houses down. The Reynolds family across the street. A retired teacher named Linda who often waved during morning walks. None of them looked angry. Most looked confused. But confusion could become assumption very quickly. Danielle knew that better than most. She reached for her purse slowly and removed her identification, placing it on the dashboard where it could be seen clearly. If there had been some misunderstanding, she wanted to make resolving it as easy as possible. A few moments later, another vehicle arrived. Unlike the others, this one did not park immediately. It rolled slowly down the center of the street before stopping near the largest cluster of officers. Several people seemed to straighten their posture when its driver stepped out. Danielle watched carefully. The man appeared to be in his mid-50s. Broad shoulders, gray at the temples, commanding presence. Even from a distance, It was obvious he carried authority. Conversations among the officers seemed to shift toward him almost instantly. Danielle could not hear what was being said, but she noticed something else. He looked directly at her house, then at her car, then back toward the officers gathered near the driveway. Whatever was happening, this man appeared to be in charge now. The neighborhood had grown nearly silent. Even the children who had been outside earlier were gone. Danielle glanced at her watch. 6:58 in the evening. Only 15 minutes had passed since she turned onto the street, yet it felt much longer. The man began walking toward her position. His expression revealed nothing. Not anger, not concern, not certainty, just focus. Danielle took a slow breath and remained calm. She had done nothing wrong. She knew that. But as the man approached her vehicle and stopped beside the open window, one unsettling thought entered her mind. If this was all a mistake, why did it seem like everyone else already believed a different story? The man stopped beside Danielle's window and studied her for several seconds before speaking. "I am Captain Stephen Brooks," he said in a calm but firm voice. "Are you Danielle Carter?" Danielle nodded. "Yes, sir. I am. Can someone finally explain why there are 10 police vehicles surrounding my home?" Brooks did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the officers behind him as if confirming something. "We are investigating a report connected to this property," he said. "Until we finish verifying information, I need your cooperation." Danielle felt a wave of frustration but kept her expression composed. "You have my cooperation. You have had it from the moment I arrived. But I still do not know what you believe happened." Brooks folded his arms. "At the moment, I am more interested in facts than assumptions." The statement sounded reasonable, yet something about it bothered her. If facts were the priority, why had no one asked her a single meaningful question? Around them, neighbors continued watching. Danielle could feel their attention. Every passing second seemed to strengthen an invisible narrative that had already begun forming in people's minds. A police presence of this size rarely appeared without a dramatic reason. People naturally filled empty spaces with their own conclusions. Across the street, she noticed two women whispering to each other. Near the corner, a teenager continued recording with his phone. Another neighbor slowly shook his head while staring toward Danielle's house. None of them knew what was happening. Neither did she. Yet the atmosphere suggested that a verdict had already been reached. Brooks looked toward the property again. "How long have you lived here?" he asked. "Almost 8 years. Do you live alone?" "Yes." "Any recent disputes with neighbors?" Danielle frowned. "No." "Any unexpected visitors during the past week?" "Not that I can think of." Brooks listened without showing any reaction. The questions seemed ordinary, but they only deepened the mystery. Danielle searched his face for clues. Nothing. He remained controlled, professional, and impossible to read. Then she noticed something unusual. An officer approached Brooks carrying a folder. The captain reviewed several pages before his expression tightened slightly. It was a small change, barely noticeable. But Danielle caught it. For the first time, he looked uncertain. The officer pointed toward a house 3 doors away before quietly saying something Danielle could not hear. Brooks nodded and handed the folder back. When he returned his attention to Danielle, the confidence he had displayed earlier seemed slightly diminished. "Not gone, just weakened." "Is there a problem?" Danielle asked. Brooks hesitated for a brief moment. "We are still sorting through information." That answer immediately stood out. Earlier, he had sounded certain. Now he sounded cautious. Danielle realized she was not the only person noticing. Several officers nearby appeared less relaxed than before. Radio traffic increased. More conversations were taking place in small groups. Whatever information had just arrived was changing the mood. Danielle remained seated, watching carefully. Something important had shifted, even if nobody was willing to admit it yet. And for the first time since arriving home, she began to suspect that the people investigating her might not fully understand the situation themselves. Danielle watched as the activity around her house became more chaotic despite everyone's attempt to appear organized. Officers moved between vehicles carrying papers, speaking into radios, and comparing information that should have matched but apparently did not. Captain Brooks stepped away to take a call, leaving Danielle alone in her car for several minutes. The neighborhood had transformed into an audience. Porch lights began turning on as daylight faded. More residents emerged from their homes, drawn by curiosity and concern. Danielle could almost hear the questions circulating through the crowd. What had she done? Why were so many officers there? Was someone in danger? The absence of answers was creating its own story. A woman Danielle recognized from the next street over slowly approached the sidewalk near her vehicle. She looked hesitant. "Danielle," she called softly. Danielle lowered her window a little further. "Hi, Karen." Karen offered an awkward smile. "Are you okay?" Danielle appreciated the question because it was the first genuine concern anyone had shown all evening. "I honestly do not know what is happening," she replied. Karen nodded. "Most of us do not either. People are saying all kinds of things." Danielle was not surprised. Rumors always moved faster than facts. Before Karen could say anything else, an officer politely directed her back toward the group of neighbors. The brief conversation ended, but it confirmed something Danielle already suspected. The crowd was filling the silence with speculation. A few minutes later, Captain Brooks returned. His expression had changed again. He no longer projected the same certainty he had shown earlier, but he was not ready to admit uncertainty either. "Miss Carter," he said, standing beside the car, "I need to ask you a few more questions." Danielle nodded. "Go ahead. Have you received any unusual mail recently? Any packages you were not expecting?" "No." "Have you allowed anyone else access to your property?" "No." "Have you rented your home to anyone?" "No." Each answer came easily because the truth was simple. Brooks listened carefully and occasionally glanced toward a notepad. Then he asked a question that immediately caught Danielle's attention. "Do you know anyone living at 814 Cedar Lane?" Danielle blinked. "That address is 3 houses down from mine." Brooks looked up. "You know the location?" "Of course I do. I walk past it almost every day." For the first time all evening, Danielle saw something close to concern in his eyes. Not concern about her. Concern about the investigation itself. He checked the notes again. Then he looked toward the neighboring houses. One officer hurried over and whispered something in his ear. Danielle could not hear the words, but she saw Brooks straighten immediately. The officer pointed toward a different property farther down the street. Brooks rubbed his forehead briefly before dismissing him. It was a tiny gesture, but it revealed more than he intended. Someone had made a mistake. Danielle did not yet know how large the mistake was, but she could feel the truth getting closer. Around them, the mood was shifting. Neighbors who had seemed convinced that something terrible was happening now appeared uncertain. Officers who had arrived with confidence were quietly reviewing details again. The entire situation felt less like an investigation and more like a puzzle that had been assembled incorrectly. Danielle remained calm. She had spent her career helping people navigate difficult situations, and she understood something many others did not. When facts and assumptions collide, assumptions usually make the louder entrance. But facts always arrive eventually. And judging by the expressions she was beginning to see, those facts were making their way down Maple Grove Estates much faster than anyone expected. The clock on Danielle's dashboard read 7:13 when another subtle shift moved through the scene. It was not dramatic. No one announced it. No sirens sounded. Yet the confidence that had carried the operation from the beginning seemed to be quietly draining away. Captain Brooks stood near 2 patrol vehicles reviewing information on a tablet while several officers gathered around him. Danielle could not hear their conversation, but she noticed something important. They were no longer giving instructions. They were asking questions. The difference mattered. Earlier, everyone had behaved as though the answers were already known. Now they appeared to be searching for them. A few neighbors noticed the change as well. The crowd that had once watched Danielle with suspicion now watched the officers with curiosity. Karen stood near the sidewalk speaking with another resident. Both occasionally glanced toward the police vehicles rather than toward Danielle. The focus of attention was beginning to move. Brooks eventually returned to her car. This time he seemed less guarded. "Miss Carter," he said, "I would like to clarify a few details regarding your property." Danielle nodded. "I would like some clarification too." The captain ignored the remark and continued. "Have you made any recent changes to your home? Construction work, renovations, ownership transfers, anything of that nature?" "No," Danielle replied. "The house is exactly the same as it has been for years." Brooks looked toward the property again. "And you are certain no one else has access?" "I am positive." He studied her face as though hoping to find hesitation. Instead, he found consistency. Every answer she had given throughout the evening matched every previous answer. There were no contradictions, no uncertainty, just facts. An officer approached carrying another folder. Brooks opened it immediately. Danielle watched his eyes move across the page. Then something happened that she would remember long after the night ended. For the first time, Captain Brooks looked genuinely surprised. He read the page again. Then a third time. "Where did this come from?" he asked the officer. "Records Division sent it 20 minutes ago," the officer replied. Brooks stared at the document before looking down the street toward house number 814. Danielle followed his gaze. Suddenly, several pieces began fitting together in her mind. Earlier, he had asked about that address. Multiple officers had pointed in that direction. The confusion seemed connected to that property, not hers. Whatever information had just arrived appeared to confirm it. Brooks closed the folder and took a slow breath. The certainty he had carried all evening was disappearing rapidly. Yet instead of acknowledging the possibility of an error, he seemed determined to maintain control of the situation. "We are still conducting our review," he said. Danielle almost smiled. Review. That word had not existed in his vocabulary an hour earlier. Earlier, there had only been confidence. Now there was review. A radio crackled nearby. Another officer received a message and hurried toward Brooks. The captain listened carefully before nodding. His jaw tightened. Whatever he had just learned was significant. Danielle remained calm, but inwardly, she felt something she had not felt since arriving home. Hope. Because mistakes can survive for a while when they are supported by assumptions. But once facts begin arriving, mistakes start running out of places to hide. By 7:25, the atmosphere on Maple Grove Estates felt completely different from the one Danielle had driven into less than an hour earlier. The flashing lights were still there. The officers were still there. The crowd was even larger. Yet certainty had vanished. In its place was something far more uncomfortable. Doubt. Danielle remained seated in her car, watching the operation slowly unravel under the weight of its own unanswered questions. Every few minutes another officer arrived carrying information. Every few minutes a new conversation began. Each conversation seemed to produce more confusion rather than clarity. Across the street, several neighbors who had initially avoided eye contact were now looking at Danielle with sympathy. Others appeared embarrassed. The assumptions that had spread so quickly were beginning to collapse. Captain Brooks stood near the hood of a patrol vehicle, studying multiple documents under the glow of a portable light. Danielle noticed him checking the same pages repeatedly. People who are confident rarely reread information. People who are worried do it all the time. A younger officer approached him and pointed toward house number 814 again. Brooks listened carefully before responding. Although Danielle could not hear the exchange, she noticed something important. The younger officer looked frustrated. Not with Danielle, with the situation itself. A few moments later, Brooks walked back toward her vehicle. His pace was slower than before, his posture less rigid. When he reached the window, he paused briefly before speaking. "Miss Carter, I have another question." Danielle nodded. "Go ahead. Have you ever had any connection whatsoever with the residents of 814 Cedar Lane?" Danielle thought about it. "Only as neighbors. The owners moved away about a year ago. Since then, I have barely seen anyone there." Brooks frowned. "You are certain?" "Yes." He looked away for a moment, staring toward the house. "Interesting." Danielle waited. The word itself revealed more than he intended. Earlier, he had acted as though he understood exactly what was happening. Now the facts were becoming interesting. That was not the language of certainty. That was the language of discovery. Before Danielle could ask another question, a police radio crackled loudly nearby. Several officers turned toward the message. One of them immediately began walking quickly toward Brooks. The captain met him halfway. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but the effect was dramatic. Brooks' expression changed instantly. Not panic, not fear, recognition. The kind of expression people make when they suddenly realize they have been looking at the wrong piece of a puzzle the entire time. Danielle saw him glance toward her house, then toward 814, then back toward her again. The sequence was impossible to ignore. Whatever information had just arrived connected directly to her. Yet instead of approaching immediately, Brooks stood motionless for several seconds, processing what he had learned. The surrounding officers seemed to sense the importance of the update as well. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Even the neighbors noticed. A strange silence settled over the block. Danielle could feel it. Everyone was waiting for something. Waiting for the next explanation. Waiting for the missing piece. Waiting for the truth. And as she watched Captain Brooks slowly walk back toward her car with a completely different look on his face, Danielle realized that the evening was about to enter a new phase. The questions were no longer about her. The questions were about how such a massive mistake had happened in the first place. Captain Brooks stopped beside Danielle's window and remained silent for several seconds. The noise from radios, conversations, and idling engines seemed distant now. His attention was fixed entirely on her. Earlier in the evening, he had spoken with the confidence of a man directing an operation. Now he looked like someone trying to understand how the operation had reached this point. "Ms. Carter," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something that may seem unrelated." Danielle folded her hands calmly in her lap. "At this point, nothing would surprise me." Brooks nodded. "Is there anyone you would contact if a situation involving your property became complicated?" Danielle studied him. The question felt unusual. More importantly, it felt late. If they wanted information about her, they could have asked that an hour ago. "Complicated in what way?" she asked. Brooks hesitated. "Complicated enough that you would want advice." Danielle noticed several officers nearby pretending not to listen while clearly listening. Whatever had been discovered was affecting more people than just Brooks. She thought for a moment. Then she answered honestly. "Yes." "Who?" Danielle looked toward her house. The same house she had left that morning expecting to return to an ordinary evening. The same house now surrounded by police vehicles, spectators, and unanswered questions. "An old family friend," she said. Brooks waited. "What kind of friend?" Danielle almost smiled. "The kind who has helped my family through difficult situations for a very long time." Brooks seemed dissatisfied with the answer, but he did not press further. Instead, he looked down at the folder in his hand. The papers inside appeared increasingly unwelcome. Before he could continue, another officer approached quickly. "Captain, records confirmed the timeline." Brooks closed his eyes briefly. "All of it?" The officer nodded. "Every part." Danielle saw the reaction immediately. Whatever uncertainty remained was gone. Not because the situation had become clearer for the police, but because the mistake had become impossible to ignore. Brooks dismissed the officer and turned back toward Danielle. Around the neighborhood, people were watching closely. Some had moved closer to the sidewalks. Others stood at the ends of driveways. The entire block seemed suspended between confusion and revelation. Danielle spoke before Brooks could. "Captain, I have answered every question you asked. I have cooperated from the moment I arrived. I think I deserve to know what is happening." Brooks looked away toward the neighboring properties. For a moment, he appeared ready to explain everything. Then his radio crackled again. A new message came through. Danielle could not hear the words, but she noticed the immediate effect. Several officers exchanged concerned looks. One officer began making phone calls. Another walked quickly toward a patrol vehicle and opened a laptop. The energy shifted again. Not toward resolution, toward urgency. Brooks lowered the radio slowly. "Ms. Carter," he said, "you may want to contact that family friend." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Why?" The captain took a deep breath. "Because this situation is becoming much larger than anyone expected." For the first time all evening, Danielle felt completely certain about something. The truth had finally surfaced. The problem was that the people responsible for the mistake were only now beginning to understand how serious it actually was. She reached for her phone, unlocked the screen, and scrolled through her contacts. Several nearby officers watched without saying a word. Danielle found the number she was looking for and paused briefly before pressing call. She knew exactly who would answer. What she did not know was how dramatically that single phone call was about to change the direction of the entire night. The phone rang only once. Danielle placed it on speaker and held it near the steering wheel. Around her, the street remained unusually quiet. Even the neighbors seemed to sense that something important was happening. Then a calm voice answered. "Danielle." There was no greeting, no confusion, just immediate recognition. "Hi, Marcus," Danielle said. "I am sorry to bother you." "You never bother me," the voice replied. "What happened?" Danielle glanced through the windshield toward the rows of police vehicles and the cluster of officers standing nearby. "I came home from work and found my house surrounded. They have been here for over an hour. Nobody seems completely sure why anymore." There was a brief pause. "Are you safe?" Marcus asked. "Yes." "Are you being threatened?" "No." "Have you done anything wrong?" Danielle almost laughed at the simplicity of the question. "No." "Then start from the beginning." As Danielle explained the events of the evening, several officers pretended not to listen. None of them succeeded. Captain Brooks stood nearby with his arms crossed. carefully observing the conversation. At first, he appeared unimpressed. To him, this probably looked like a citizen calling a friend for advice. But as the conversation continued, Danielle noticed something. Marcus did not ask emotional questions. He asked precise questions. Times, addresses, names, actions, sequences, details. The kind of questions asked by someone accustomed to evaluating situations rather than reacting to them. When Danielle finished, the line remained silent for several seconds. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I need the exact address." Danielle gave it to him. "And the captain's name?" She looked toward Brooks. "Captain Stephen Brooks." Brooks shifted slightly when he heard his name spoken. Marcus repeated it calmly. "Understood." Another pause followed. Then he asked one final question. "Danielle, have they explained why 10 police vehicles were sent to your property?" "No." "Have they explained why your neighbors were left to assume the worst?" "No." "Have they explained why the focus appears to have shifted toward another address?" Danielle looked directly at Brooks. "No." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened all evening. Marcus finally exhaled. "All right." His voice remained calm, but something had changed. Not anger. Not frustration. Certainty. "I'm going to make a few calls." Danielle nodded, even though he could not see her. "Thank you. Stay exactly where you are. Be respectful. Be patient. And do not worry." Before ending the call, Marcus added one more sentence. "This situation should never have reached this point." Then the line disconnected. Danielle lowered the phone. Nothing happened immediately. No dramatic announcement. No sudden revelation. The crowd remained where it was. The officers remained where they were. Yet within 3 minutes, the first phone rang. An officer standing near a patrol vehicle answered and immediately looked surprised. Less than a minute later, another phone rang. Then another. Danielle watched expressions change across the street. Conversations became shorter. Movements became faster. Information began flowing through the operation at a pace she had not seen all evening. Captain Brooks received a call of his own. He listened without speaking. The longer he listened, the more serious his expression became. When the call ended, he stared at the screen for several seconds before slowly lowering the phone. Around him, officers were now looking toward him for answers. But for the first time since Danielle arrived home, it appeared that Captain Brooks was the one searching for them. The next 10 minutes felt unlike anything Danielle had experienced before. Nobody announced a change in direction, yet the entire operation seemed to be moving under a different set of rules. Officers who had spent the evening projecting confidence were suddenly checking details, making calls, and reviewing reports with unusual urgency. Several patrol cars remained in place, but the energy around them had shifted dramatically. Captain Brooks stood beside his vehicle speaking to someone on the phone. Unlike earlier conversations, this one was short. When it ended, another call came almost immediately. Then another. Danielle watched as he listened far more than he spoke. That alone told her something important. People in command usually spend their time giving answers. Brooks now appeared to be receiving them. Across the street, neighbors had stopped whispering about Danielle. Their attention was fixed on the officers. Karen folded her arms and quietly watched the activity. Mr. Hansen shook his head as if trying to understand how such a large response had ended up centered on the wrong place. Even the teenager who had been recording earlier seemed more interested in the police vehicles than in Danielle herself. Assumptions were dissolving one by one. Facts were slowly taking their place. An officer approached Brooks carrying a tablet. The captain reviewed the screen and immediately asked for something else. Another officer hurried toward a patrol car. A third began making calls from the sidewalk. Danielle noticed a pattern. Everyone seemed to be chasing information that should have been confirmed before the operation ever reached her street. The realization appeared to be spreading through the entire team. A few minutes later, Brooks walked toward her vehicle again. This time there was no attempt to appear authoritative. He looked tired. "Miss Carter," he said, "I would like to thank you for your patience." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "That sounds different from earlier." Brooks nodded slightly. "Earlier, I believed we were dealing with a straightforward situation. And now," he hesitated, "now I believe several important assumptions were made before all available information was reviewed." It was not an apology, but it was the closest thing she had heard all evening. Danielle glanced toward the neighboring properties. "So this was never really about me?" Brooks followed her gaze. "The answer to that question is becoming increasingly clear." Before Danielle could respond, A black SUV slowly entered the neighborhood. It was not a police vehicle. No lights. No markings. Nothing that would attract attention under normal circumstances. Yet the moment it appeared, several officers noticed it. One officer stopped talking mid-sentence. Another straightened his posture. Brooks himself turned toward the approaching vehicle and remained completely focused on it. Danielle watched carefully. The SUV parked near the edge of the operation. The driver did not exit immediately. Instead, another phone rang. Then another. A final call reached Brooks. He answered quickly, listened for less than 30 seconds, and ended the conversation without speaking a single word. When he lowered the phone, his expression revealed something Danielle had not seen all evening. Not confusion, not frustration, not concern, recognition. Whatever was happening now had a direct connection to the call she made. And judging by the reaction spreading through the street, the people who had spent hours questioning her were about to learn exactly who Marcus Reed really was. The driver's door of the black SUV opened at exactly 7:42. Nobody rushed forward. Nobody made an announcement. Yet the reaction across the street was immediate. Conversation stopped. Officers who had been moving between vehicles suddenly stood still. Even the neighbors seemed to sense that whoever had arrived carried significance. Danielle remained seated in her car and watched as a tall man stepped onto the pavement. He looked to be in his late 50s. His posture was relaxed. His clothing was simple. Nothing about his appearance suggested someone seeking attention. Yet attention followed him anyway. Captain Brooks began walking toward him almost immediately. The two men met near the center of the street and exchanged a brief conversation. Danielle could not hear the words, but she noticed something important. Brooks was listening far more than he was speaking. The dynamic had completely reversed. Earlier in the evening, Brooks had been the person everyone looked to for answers. Now he appeared to be receiving instructions. Several officers nearby exchanged uncertain glances. One quietly lowered his phone after reading a message. Another stepped away from a patrol vehicle and began reviewing paperwork again. The entire operation seemed to be reorganizing itself around information that had only recently surfaced. After a few minutes, the man from the SUV turned toward Danielle's vehicle and smiled. It was a calm, reassuring smile. The kind given by someone who already understands more than everyone else in the room. He walked over and stopped beside her open window. "Danielle," he said warmly, "I am sorry your evening turned into this." Danielle smiled for the first time all night. "Marcus." Several officers nearby visibly reacted to the name. Not dramatically, just enough to confirm what Danielle already suspected. Marcus Reed was not simply an old family friend. Captain Brooks approached and stopped a few feet away. Marcus acknowledged him politely before returning his attention to Danielle. "I reviewed what information was available," Marcus said. "There appears to have been a serious chain of assumptions made before critical facts were verified." Brooks remained silent. Marcus continued speaking in the same calm tone. "The original concern appears to have involved activity connected to another property. Somewhere along the process, records, addresses, and timelines became mixed together. By the time the mistake was discovered, too many resources had already been committed to the wrong location." Danielle glanced toward house number 814. Everything suddenly made sense. The repeated questions, the changing reports, the growing confusion. The operation had been chasing a problem that never belonged to her. Marcus looked toward Brooks. To his credit, Captain Brooks did eventually stop treating assumptions as facts. Unfortunately, that happened later than it should have. Brooks accepted the observation without argument. That alone spoke volumes. One of the officers standing nearby quietly informed another that additional verification had arrived from Records Division. The second officer immediately nodded. The confirmation was spreading through the operation one step at a time. Danielle looked at Marcus. "You moved very quickly." Marcus laughed softly. "Not really. I simply called people who value accurate information." One of the neighbors standing nearby suddenly whispered something to Karen. Karen's eyes widened. News was beginning to travel through the crowd. People were learning who Marcus Reed was. A retired Navy SEAL. A respected consultant who had spent years advising organizations on risk assessment, crisis response, and operational accountability. More importantly, a man whose phone calls were rarely ignored. As understanding spread through the street, Danielle noticed a remarkable change. The evening was no longer about suspicion. It was becoming a conversation about responsibility. And for the first time since arriving home, the truth was no longer struggling to catch up. It was finally taking the lead. As the truth spread through the operation, the consequences began arriving faster than anyone expected. What started as a simple review of records quickly became something much larger. Officers were no longer comparing notes to support a theory. They were comparing notes to understand how the theory had survived for so long. Captain Brooks stood beside a patrol vehicle speaking with supervisors over the phone. Danielle noticed that every conversation seemed to follow the same pattern. He would listen, answer a question, consult a document, then listen again. The confidence that had defined the first hour of the evening had been replaced by accountability. Around the neighborhood, residents who had gathered out of curiosity were now witnessing something entirely different. They were watching a system correct itself in real time. Karen quietly walked closer to Danielle's vehicle once officers relaxed the perimeter around the immediate area. "I knew something was not adding up," she said softly. Danielle smiled. "I wish more people had reached that conclusion earlier." Karen looked embarrassed. People saw police cars and assumed the worst. Danielle nodded. "That happens more often than people realize." Nearby, several officers began returning equipment to their vehicles. Others were collecting paperwork and updating reports. The operation was not ending yet, but it was clearly moving toward a conclusion. Marcus stood calmly near the black SUV, speaking with a senior official who had arrived only minutes earlier. Danielle noticed something interesting. Marcus never raised his voice. He never demanded anything. He simply asked questions. Precise questions. Questions that required precise answers. And those answers were producing results. An officer carrying a folder approached Captain Brooks. The captain reviewed the contents and immediately called over two supervisors. Their discussion lasted several minutes. When it ended, one supervisor shook his head slowly and looked toward Danielle's house. Whatever the report contained, it confirmed that critical information had been available much earlier in the evening. It simply had not been connected properly. The dominoes continued falling. One incorrect assumption had led to another. One misunderstanding had supported the next. By the time the operation reached Maple Grove Estates, too many people had accepted a narrative before verifying the facts. Now every step was being retraced. Every decision was being examined. Danielle watched the process without satisfaction or anger. She felt something else entirely. Relief. Not because she had been proven right. She already knew she was right. Relief because reality was finally catching up with perception. A few minutes later, Captain Brooks approached her again. This time there was no distance between official procedure and personal responsibility. "Ms. Carter," he said, "a complete review has confirmed that your property should never have been the focus of this operation." Danielle met his eyes. "I suspected that some time ago." Brooks nodded. "You were correct." He paused before continuing. "Several errors occurred during information processing and verification. Those errors created a chain reaction that brought resources to the wrong location." Danielle looked around at the remaining police vehicles, the neighbors, and the officers who were now working to untangle the consequences of those mistakes. The evening had begun with assumptions. It was ending with facts. And facts, she had learned long ago, always demanded a price from the people who ignored them. By 8 o'clock, the last pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. What had begun as confusion was now documented fact. Supervisors, records personnel, and responding officers had reconstructed the timeline step by step. The review revealed that information connected to another property had been incorrectly associated with Danielle's address during a chain of administrative checks. Once that error entered the process, subsequent assumptions reinforced it instead of challenging it. The result was an operation that grew larger with each layer of mistaken confirmation. Standing beside her vehicle, Danielle listened as Captain Brooks explained what investigators had uncovered. His tone was measured and direct. There was no attempt to minimize what had happened. There was no effort to shift responsibility elsewhere. The facts spoke for themselves. The address that should have been reviewed more carefully was not hers. The records that should have been cross-checked were not fully verified. The conclusions that should have remained tentative were treated as established too early. Around them, officers continued collecting equipment and preparing to leave. Several neighbors remained outside, not because they were searching for drama anymore, but because they wanted to see how the evening would end. Many of them had watched the entire situation unfold from beginning to end. They had witnessed the assumptions, They had witnessed the confusion, and now they were witnessing the correction. Marcus remained nearby, speaking occasionally with senior personnel who had arrived during the review process. Danielle noticed that every conversation seemed focused on procedures rather than personalities. The goal was not to blame a single individual. The goal was to understand how multiple small failures had combined into one highly visible mistake. That distinction mattered. A younger officer approached Danielle and offered a quiet apology. Then another did the same. Neither speech was long. Neither sounded rehearsed. Both sounded sincere. Danielle thanked them and wished them a safe evening. Her response surprised some of the neighbors, but Marcus understood immediately. He walked over and smiled. "You know something most people forget," he said. Danielle looked at him. "What is that?" "Accountability works best when people are allowed to learn from it." Danielle glanced toward the remaining patrol vehicles. "I hope they do." Marcus nodded. "I think tonight gave them a reason." Near the end of the street, Karen spoke with several residents who had spent hours speculating about what was happening. The conversations sounded different now. Earlier, they had been driven by rumors. Now they were driven by facts. The contrast was impossible to miss. Captain Brooks eventually returned one final time. He informed Danielle that the review findings would be formally documented and that additional internal evaluation would follow. He also offered a direct apology for the impact the situation had on her and her neighborhood. Danielle accepted it, not because the evening could be erased. It could not. But because acknowledging the truth was the first step toward repairing the damage caused by misunderstanding. As the final reports were completed and the remaining questions answered, Maple Grove Estates slowly began returning to normal. The flashing lights grew fewer. The radios became quieter. The crowd thinned. And for the first time since Danielle turned onto her street that evening, there were no more assumptions left standing between reality and the truth. At 8:23, the final patrol vehicle pulled away from Maple Grove Estates. The flashing lights that had dominated the neighborhood for nearly 2 hours disappeared around the corner, leaving behind something that felt almost unfamiliar. Silence. Danielle stood at the end of her driveway and watched the street return to what it had been before the confusion arrived. Porch lights glowed softly across the neighborhood. Crickets had begun their evening chorus. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. The ordinary sounds of home had finally returned. Neighbors slowly made their way back inside. Several stopped to speak with Danielle before leaving. Karen hugged her briefly and apologized for some of the assumptions people had made during the evening. Mr. Hansen shook her hand and admitted that seeing so many police vehicles had caused him to jump to conclusions. Danielle accepted every apology with grace. She understood something important. Fear and uncertainty often encourage people to believe the first explanation they hear. It takes patience and character to wait for facts. Marcus stood beside his SUV preparing to leave. Danielle walked over and smiled. "Thank you for coming." Marcus returned the smile. "You would have been fine without me." Danielle laughed softly. "Maybe, but things certainly moved faster once you started making calls." Marcus looked down the quiet street. The calls helped. The truth helped more. Danielle knew he was right. His influence had not created the facts. It had simply helped ensure that the facts were finally heard. For a moment, both stood in comfortable silence. Then Marcus spoke again. "Do you know what impressed me most tonight?" Danielle raised an eyebrow. "What?" "You never lost your composure." Danielle thought about the long evening. The confusion, the rumors, the assumptions, the frustration of being treated like a question mark in her own neighborhood. "I wanted to," she admitted. "Several times." Marcus nodded. "But you did not. That matters. People remember how someone behaves when circumstances become unfair." Danielle looked toward her house. The front porch light was still on. Her car remained parked where she had left it. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Yet somehow it all felt different. Marcus eventually climbed into his vehicle. Before closing the door, he offered one final thought. The truth does not always arrive first. Sometimes it arrives last. But if people keep looking for it, it usually gets there. Danielle watched as the SUV disappeared down the street. Then she turned and walked toward her front door. Inside, her untouched dinner still sat in the refrigerator. Her favorite television show had long since started. The evening she planned was gone. Yet she felt surprisingly at peace. Because the story had ended where it should have ended. Not with anger. Not with revenge. Not with humiliation. It ended with accountability. It ended with facts. It ended with people correcting a mistake instead of defending it. As Danielle stepped inside her home and closed the door behind her, she reflected on a lesson that many people never learn. Assumptions can arrive in seconds. Rumors can spread in minutes. Crowds can form before the truth even has a chance to speak. But truth has one advantage that assumptions never will. It does not need help remembering what happened. And eventually, if enough people are willing to listen, it speaks for itself.